Hello and welcome to the Earth Observed podcast, a podcast where I sit down with the founders, the technical leaders, and the minds shaping the future of Earth data, geospatial technology, and atmospheric AI across Europe, North America, and beyond. In each episode, we take a vertical dive into a topic chosen by our guest, giving you a front row seat to the ideas, the tools, and the challenges that enable innovation from space to subsurface and everything in between. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Sam Wilks. Sam is a product leader with 10 years of experience working on high impact problems to improve the health of people and planet. He's shipped products globally, starting his career in Toronto and San Francisco, and then shifting focus to emerging markets where he worked on access to medicine through pharmacies and improving the quality of care at clinics in East Africa. He's more recently transitioned to climate, where he worked with VIDA on their physical climate risk product. And very, very excited to be joined by Sam today, where we're going to be talking about climate, product, and physical risk. Sam, how are you today?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks for the intro, Sam. Very excited to be here.
Yes, as I am too. You seem to be a really significant contributor to this particular community and industry, and I had to get you on for sure. So thank you very much for joining me. Can you tell us about your career journey so far and how you found your way into climate technology?
Yeah, so my career has taken what I would say is maybe a somewhat unconventional path. I started off studying business and computer science in undergrad, and while I was there, I did a few internships in Toronto and San Francisco, which, as you mentioned, was the start of my journey, and graduated feeling like there was kind of more to learn about in the world, and decided to take a 4-month post-graduation internship in Nairobi, Kenya. And I thought it would just be 4 months. That opportunity was working on access to medicine through healthcare. And I kind of got to East Africa and just loved it. I fell in love with the country, with the problems that I was working on. And so that 4-month post-graduation internship turned into 5 years and helping to kind of start and run 2 different companies. At the time, I was working in health tech. After 5 years, I felt like that chapter of my life was kind of ready, or I was ready for that chapter of my life to come to a close. And was looking around for new challenges outside of that specific context. And I had always been interested in climate change as a topic. It resonated with me a lot in terms of being one of the major challenges of our time. But I'd always thought about it as a hardware problem. And so I thought, oh, well, it would have been great if I had studied something else or if I had a different skill set. But started to talk to more people in my network and realized that there were all of these really cool software applications, and actually a lot of them were geospatial. I realized how much very, very cool, or how many very, very cool things were being done in climate in the geospatial space, and kind of started to deep dive. This was now around the end of 2023. Through that exploration, I found VIDA, and adaptation and resilience, having spent a lot of time in emerging markets, was really salient to me as a subject area. I kind of got into it through the angle that while developed markets have created most of the climate change problem, it's emerging markets that are going to have to kind of face the worst outcomes of it.
Yeah.
And then found myself in physical climate risk, and had a really, really good time kind of working with VIDA to get their product off the ground, to learn about the space, and am now fully committed to staying in climate and seeing where the space goes. It's really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, exemplified by the communities that you yourself are building, some of the workshops that you're putting together, some of the events that you're putting together, kind of the personal brand as well that you're building. But I'm keen to understand, you've worked in health tech, coffee marketplaces. would love to learn a bit more about that. And now climate risk. What's the thread that ties those experiences together?
In a word, impact. Since the beginning of my career, have been interested in how you can use technology at scale to create positive change in the world. Um, Impact was what drove me to Kenya. It seemed like there were a lot of really interesting problems there that were not only going to be fun to solve, but would have a really positive impact on people's lives. That is kind of also what got me into coffee marketplaces. I was interested in food systems and how food systems can impact people's lives. Although, admittedly, there was also a bit of I just really like food and also love coffee, so that was the other motivation for doing that briefly. And I guess to put that in context, I was in between leaving Kenya and then moving into climate. Although obviously coffee has a very large kind of climate angle, although that's not kind of specifically what we were working on. Um, and impact continues to drive my choices. I think it's what gets me out of bed every morning, excited to work on climate solutions.
Question. When it comes to
Yeah.
coffee, what is your order?
Oh, when I'm out, I order a flat white, because or a cortado. I think if it's a
Yeah,
really fancy specialty coffee place, I'll have a cortado. At home, for the coffee nerds out there, I do a V60, and I have like my hand grinder and my scale and all of
nice,
those fancy
nice.
coffee plants.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can tell that you've worked in a coffee marketplace before. For me, it's coconut vanilla flat white as well, or a coconut vanilla latte. Yeah, I've just got this obsession with all things coconut. Yeah, for sure. No, good choice though. I respect that a lot. Um, the thing is, like within the climate technology space, you could work in so many different verticals, so many different areas, and all these products are fantastic. They all have their own place within the realm. What drew you specifically to climate risk products?
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial kind of impetus behind it was that kind of dichotomy between developed markets driving climate change and then emerging markets needing to pay for it. That was the context that I was coming from, and I think to kind of bring it back to the impact angle, that was what resonated with me the most. Um, I think now that and then also I should say the geospatial angle. I was also very excited about getting to work with maps. I think now that I have been in the space for a little over a year and a half, I also love the intersection of science and technology. Getting to work with scientists has been an absolute pleasure. It's been a joy to learn how the world works, even if it's in this kind of bleak context, kind of getting a front row seat to how all of these atmospheric changes lead to changes in storms and floods and heat, just kind of scratches a nerdy itch that I have. And I think also helps me to work in a field that can be a little depressing. You are kind of face to face with some pretty bleak outcomes, and it helps to have a kind of genuine interest in it, and also to be able to kind of tie it back to its resonance as a really important problem for the world.
It's really interesting. I was driving home last night listening to LBC, and they mentioned that an English sparkling wine had won an award internationally. You're probably thinking, where am I going with this? Well, what they also mentioned was that the south of England is starting to get warmer in general, and a lot of vineyard investors and owners, those who do produce the goods themselves, are starting to buy land in these what they would like to consider the Garden of England, the southern parts of England. So it's really interesting, just from a consumer's perspective, such as mine, to hear that. And go Britain, I guess. Fantastic. I
Yeah.
guess in regards to climate risk and, let's say, coffee, for example, um, what's the correlation there? If you can answer that, is there a huge tie between those two areas? Clearly, they are two areas that are of real significant interest and passion to you. So I'm just keen to understand if there is a strong link between the two, the quality of the coffee bean, maybe, particular areas around the globe where coffee is, found, like, Arabica beans and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ties. I would say in terms of climate risk, coffee is at is subject to similar risks as other areas of agriculture, where climate change means more extreme rainfall and more droughts. So when it rains more intensely, and when it doesn't rain for longer. Um, Arabica coffee specifically is very temperamental. So what coffee needs to be delicious is cold nights and warm days. And I could not tell you exactly what the scientific mechanisms are there, but
That's fine.
that's why coffee is typically grown around the equator at altitude, because the altitude gets you cold nights, and being around the equator gets you warm days and consistent climates. Um, but it's very sensitive. And so what is happening is that lower altitude coffee, it's becoming too hot. And so that will decrease the quality. And then farmers are dealing with droughts and floods and all of these other risks, and those shocks affect the price of coffee. I know that scientists are looking into ways of building more kind of climate resistant coffee. And that means kind of shifting away from Arabica beans in some cases and trying to develop kind of new strains. Um, Coffee is also, unfortunately, a relatively high emitter. That's partly from transportation and partly from the amount of water that's used in the process. And so it also, to an extent, contributes to the problem. And then there are also going to be your kind of standard supply chain shocks. And coffee won't be different from other kind of commodity or commodity-like crops, but you should expect to see disruptions around supply chains as the result of extreme events.
Interesting. So for people who might not work directly in climate risk, what is climate risk and how does a climate risk product actually work?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that climate risk is actually broken into two categories. The first one, which is my expertise, is physical climate risk. And so that is the direct impact from the changing climate on extreme events, such as floods, wildfires, storms, as well as the effect of climate change on chronic hazards such as extreme heat, although often there is kind of a pairing. Increase in temperature is a chronic hazard, whereas extreme heat or a heat wave is an acute hazard. And then the second category is transition risk, which is a bit more about both risk and opportunity. And transition risk is, what is the risk to a company or the opportunities the company might have from the transition to a green energy future. So an easy way of conceptualizing that is, let's say you own a coal plant and the regulations in your country say that all coal plants must be decommissioned by 2030. There is a risk to your business from needing to close down that coal plant. You'll have lost revenues, you'll have lost asset value, and so that would be a transition risk. Another thing could be the cost of switching a gas-powered transportation fleet to electricity. But then the flip side of that is there are also opportunities. So, a transition opportunity might be like developing intelligent solutions for EV fleets. And so those are the two kind of broad categories of climate risk. I'll talk mostly about physical climate risk and what that looks like. In the simplest terms, a climate risk product gives you intelligence or gives you insights into the hazards for a specific location, usually for a specific asset or object. And so that can be anything from what is the risk to your home. If any of your listeners have recently bought a house, there's a good chance that their mortgage has come along with a risk report. It could also be for a neighborhood or a city. So the output could be any number of things. And to all of our geospatial listeners, all of this data is kind of overlaid on a map. So usually you have broken up the world into squares and you will get risk analytics for a specific square. And that could be anything from, those could be very large regional squares. So how do we expect heat to change over a 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer space? Or it could be very fine grained. Some of these flood models are down to the kind of meter level resolution. And I guess to simplify all of that, usually what a physical climate risk product looks like is kind of Google Maps, but when you drop a pin, you get risks rather than directions.
I guess as well, is the mission of said product there to mitigate said risk or to eradicate said risk, or none of the above?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a few different approaches in the market. The minimum level that you need, like the minimum level of insight that you need as a climate risk product, is to identify hazards for an area. That is useful in some way. Like if you as an asset owner know that there is a high probability of a flood in the next few years, that is your baseline level of information. To bubble up one level from that, most regulations, and I would say in order to be kind of minimally competitive in the market or useful to people, you have to have some kind of materiality calculation. And so what that means is, given a specific asset, I already used the example of a single family home, but it could be an office building, it could be a solar farm, it could be a wind farm, it could be a data center. What is the expected damage from a hazard to that asset? And I think hopefully we'll talk about this a bit more later. But once you have that information, so let's say, the expected damage to the home that I just bought over the next 30 years is, approximately 1% of the value of the home. What can I do about that to mitigate it? And as the market matures, I think you're increasingly going to see packaged solutions where you have a one-stop shop to get both an understanding of those hazards, how they will affect whatever the thing is that you care about, and then what to do about it. But at least for now, because the market is still early days, often players are only kind of tackling one part of that equation. So you might get one platform might tell you that your asset is at high risk, and then you would have to go to an engineering firm or get some kind of technical assessment to implement an adaptation solution.
Interesting. And how do you see the climate risk industry evolving over the next few years, and who do you think will come out ahead in this space?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's kind of a few major components to how I think the industry will evolve. I think first of all, you're going to have urgency shifts. So especially in the first half of the decade, everyone was kind of trying to wrap their head around this problem. And what we saw, certainly at VIDA, was that there was a lack of urgency. And this will vary depending on the sector and who specifically you're talking to. But I think as the intensity and frequency of these climate disasters increases, you are going to see more and more representation of climate change in the kind of bottom line balance sheets of companies. And that could be, your big financial institutions, it could be larger companies, it could be even SMEs. And I think as the market matures, and unfortunately as climate change gets worse, it's going to become more and more important to be really proactive in identifying your risk, and then what mitigation solutions you need to implement. So that's kind of number one. Number two is there's going to be pretty significant improvements in modeling. So right now, kind of most organizations are building off of the same core base of models, although that depends a lot on the hazard. And there's a lot of differentiation in terms of things like downscaling. So how do you take a relatively coarse model, so let's say 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers, and make it more kind of regional or asset specific? That modeling is continuously improving, and more accurate modeling is going to drive a more accurate ROI loop. So, given that we understand this risk and we've done something about it, we can show what that impact is on our kind of core balance sheet. And I think that's going to drive increased adoption. The third thing is AI, which is feeding into the previous point. I mean, AI is revolutionizing pretty much every industry. Um, and it's going to have, and has already begun to have, and will have an even larger effect on physical climate risk. So you'll see improvements in downscaling, you'll see improvements in core modeling, you'll see improvements in prediction models, and so what you're going to get is kind of more accurate forecasting and predictions. And then there are also huge benefits to effectively implementing agentic AI for things like monitoring of disasters and proactive localized disaster response. So I think there's a lot there. And then the final thing that I would highlight is adoption of regulation. So regulatory frameworks like CSRD in the EU are starting to come into force. And I'll try to stay away from kind of regulation acronym soup, but the other one that's worth mentioning is ISSB, which is being implemented globally in over 36 jurisdictions. So kind of across the world, we're seeing governments really acknowledge and care about making sure that they're looking into adaptation and resilience.
I know CSRD and EUDR. What's ISSB?
So ISSB is a kind of continuation of TCFD,
Okay.
which was that was the historic one. TCFD said we are done, we've finished close to the end of 2023, and its pillars were then folded into ISSB. So whereas TCFD was kind of designed to be an optional framework for implementing climate and sustainability regulations, ISSB is a bit more ready to go out of the box.
Yeah, yeah. I've also had multiple conversations with leaders and business owners, hiring managers across Europe who are building products around the EUDR, looking at deforestation within supply chains. I would imagine that that falls under the climate risk category. Would that be correct?
So nature, that sounds like more nature and biodiversity risk,
Okay.
which is often those are often grouped together, and there have also been regulations that have been huge in driving greater adoption of nature and biodiversity solutions. But I would say that's a bit separate, although they're often related, because a like a more extreme disasters also negatively impact biodiversity and
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's really important that I've just brought that up there because you've identified the fact that, yeah, okay, those two are sometimes grouped together, but actually, you know, I do believe that each pillar, each kind of vertical, each kind of risk area does deserve its own spotlight ultimately, so that things aren't diluted and attention and investment is spread evenly across these multiple areas. So thank you very much for bringing that up there. I guess moving forward as well, I'd be very keen to understand what your big learnings from your journey in climate as a product leader so far, what has worked and what hasn't.
So there's a few things I'd want to highlight. I would say first of all, it's important to be strongly opinionated, and I think that this definitely applies to climate risk, but I would say it also applies to other nascent or emerging markets, of which there's a lot in climate. And what I mean by that is early on at VIDA, we leaned heavily on providing these kind of beautiful visualized geospatial climate risk data layers. And what we did there was we solved the visibility problem. So going back to my previous answer, we solved the first bit of that chain that gets you from like identification of hazards to materiality and then eventually to mitigation and adaptation solutions. And that worked for us in some areas, but ultimately our kind of big unlock, what we found was really effective, was putting the work in to identify what was going to be most important in each case for each customer, so for a specific asset, and giving them a kind of single, unified, simple answer. And to do that, we had to develop strong opinions on what was most important to put into our methodology, and kind of what was most important for our clients to understand. And that kind of bubbles down to the second big learning, which is ultimately you're going to win customers by building trust. And really establishing an effective trust apparatus is going to be huge for any product leader. So that means working really closely with the relationship owners at your company to make sure you're being proactive, doing things like sending analysis of climate disasters as they happen, even if they aren't specifically relevant to the assets that your customers own, and kind of doing those little proactive things to build trust. And then obviously, your underlying models need to be uh, good enough to compete in the market. Um, for your geospatial listeners, maps are really really cool, and customers love maps. Um, but they also often don't specifically include the answers that your customers are looking for. As a product person, I would say they're delighter features, so people love them, but they can also get the answers they need without that visual representation. In general, in product, I always try to operate from priors. So, what were customers doing before they had your solution? And in most cases, across many different climate verticals, what they were doing is getting reports. And so this is a bit more applicable for earlier stage companies, but often you can build simple solutions without needing the full map. And then the fourth thing that I'll highlight is that you have to be able to work effectively with science teams. So products in climate are almost always built on a foundation of science, and so you have to be able to speak that same language. And I think like the kind of easiest way of explaining that difference is in product, we're trained to go for maximum 80% answers. Like the idea is you get something out quickly, you learn from your customers, you iterate. Whereas scientists have been trained to get to 100%. And both of those approaches are valid, and in some cases it's really important to get to 100%, especially when you're talking about things like disaster response, or identifying risks that are going to be really important for human life or for kind of large amounts of damage. But it's also important as a business and as a product person to get solutions out quickly, to get that feedback from the market. And so I think being able to kind of integrate scientists into your workflow so that you can figure out when you need to go for 100% and when you need to go for 80 is all very important.
Yeah, nice, nice. And I guess looking ahead then, speaking of forward guidance, what are the major trends you see shaping the climate tech landscape in the next few years? I know you've already mentioned AI, and I think it's very easy nowadays to allude to AI when being asked that question. But yeah, I'm very keen to understand if beyond things like AI, you can include AI if you'd like, but if there's anything beyond AI that you think could really emerge.
Yeah, well, you know what? Let me start with AI, and I'll expand what I've said on it, because I do think that while just saying that AI is going to revolutionize an industry doesn't get you very far, it is also true that it is kind of changing everything. Um, and so a few kind of cool, like very cool applications to highlight are, there's been a lot of cases of AI being able to optimize energy use. I think Google showed it in their data centers, and now they're trying to scale that up to optimizing for kind of cities and municipalities. Um, I've already mentioned kind of strengthening disaster response. I don't think I need to get into it more. And then there's a lot of applications that are not on the software side. So a particularly cool one that I heard about recently was synthesizing new proteins that decarbonize meat and dairy. So essentially like reducing the amount of methane that cows will produce. And to wade into a slightly more controversial topic, there's a lot of talk on how much AI is going to contribute to climate just by the additional energy use in data centers. I think in terms of other trends, the big sectors that I think will see the most growth over the next few years are electrification and energy, and specifically grid energy, grid infrastructure, storage, and electrification of transportation and heating. Costs are going down, and there is kind of, especially outside of the US, a lot of incentive for governments to really push those programs. And then also adaptation and resilience in transportation are other big ones. Um, Another big one, or not, sorry, another big input to this is real climate events getting worse. We've kind of already talked about that. And then the regulatory landscape is going to continue to evolve as more and more countries adopt effective climate regulations.
And how are these trends changing the way that you think about product strategy in in climate technology?
Well, I think perhaps unsurprisingly, I think everyone needs to have an AI strategy, but only
Yeah.
where it makes sense. I think there's a lot of companies, and there's a lot of kind of just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. But there are also really huge gains in delivering better predictive accuracy, operational efficiency, and material innovation with AI. But it needs to be applied intelligently. Um, I think the strongest business models and the companies that like I'm really watching that I think will do well are ones where you can show direct ROI to those businesses. So, for example, in climate risk, can you show that the adoption of these climate risk tools is having a positive effect on the bottom line? Um, and kind of within that, compliance is a form of ROI. And so, if you are avoiding kind of penalties from regulations, that is a really effective way of showing that you're kind of driving core business value. It is still very important to be directly integrated with regulations in key markets. And it's also important to have a differentiated strategy so that regulatory shifts, such as what we've just seen happen in the US, uh, those shifts don't completely tank your business. Um, and I'll also say trust, accuracy, and verification are all going to continue to be super, super important. These are all climate software are modeling kind of the real world, and building that trust with customers is a central pillar of pretty much any climate tech business. And the final thing I would say, and this is a kind of a bit of a personal bias, but I would say don't get caught up being a reporting tool. Regulations and the kind of energy of the industry in general, not the energy industry, but like the direction the industry is going is towards action over disclosure.
It's really interesting what you've just mentioned there in terms of like reporting and not to be too caught up in that. Because over the past, I'd say, year or two now, ESG, it seems to have gone quiet from a product standpoint. Is it that, and that's my own personal view, so most definitely not objective, but are people pivoting into more impactful products, or have maybe people given up on the idea of ESG, and what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think my take on this is that the amount of noise in the US has kind of drowned out the rest of the world, which where there hasn't been as dramatic a shift. There has been some scaling back in Europe with CSRD kind of being softened a little bit and the number of companies that need to report on it being reduced. But I don't see there being so much of a global retreat from ESG as the kind of teeth being taken out of the regulatory environment in the US. I think that the key thing for companies that are kind of squarely in the ESG space will be to really establish that kind of core ROI argument on this is not just good for reporting, but it's also good for your business bottom line. But as I said, compliance is a form of ROI. And so I think if these companies can be strategic about where they are rolling out their tools and kind of hedge against other regulatory shifts in different markets, I don't expect ESG will go away. I think we're in a kind of low point of the cycle in regionally, but I don't think it's going to go away.
Well, look, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on today's episode of Earth Observed. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. We've spoken a lot about climate technology in general, product, and of course, physical climate risk. And I hope that those watching today have learned just a little bit more about this particular space from the master craftsman, Sam Wilks. Sam, any final thoughts, any final comments?
Just thank you for your time. This has been a ton of fun.
Awesome.
Really appreciate the invite to be on here.
Absolutely. And over the next 6 to 12 months, what we'll do is we'll get you back on and get an update on where you're at, what you're doing, and kind of what developments we've spoken about today have actually taken place. Awesome. Okay. And for those watching, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, take care of yourself, and until next time, goodbye. Hello, and thank you for watching today's episode of Earth Observed, powered by DeepReg AI. If you're interested in joining me for an episode of your own to discuss a topic of your choice, do get in contact with me. And of course, if you are looking to scale your team within geospatial, Earth data, or atmospheric AI, please do get in contact. I'd love to understand how I can support you. Until next time, have a great day.